The scent of pine and rotting wood had become a strange sort of comfort. It was the smell of solitude, of safety. For 3 weeks, this dilapidated hunter's shack at the farthest edge of the Blackwood territory had been my world, a crumbling fortress against a fate I refused to accept. Outside, the world was preparing for the choosing. Inside, I was simply preparing to be forgotten. I ran a thumb over the cold metal of the pendant I wore, a habit that had worn the silver smooth over the years. It was a crescent moon, intricately carved, a gift from my mother, Elindra, before the silence had taken her. "Some are born to shout, Calaran," she had whispered to me once, her own scent of lavender and rain already starting to fade, a sign of the sickness that would eventually claim her. "You were born to listen. There is a different kind of power in that." I hadn't understood then. I was just a child, already ostracized, already feeling the hollow space where my scent should have been. Among the shifter packs, scent was everything. It was identity, status, a declaration of self. Alphas smelled of ozone and command. Betas carried the steady scent of earth and loyalty. Even the lowest pack members had something: musk, grass, riverstone. I had nothing. A void, a genetic misprint that rendered me a ghost in a world of vibrant aromas, broken, defective. The elders called me a dud, an omega so recessive she was practically human. The word was always spat, an insult of the highest order. "My name is Calaran." I was 19, and I was hiding from the Alpha King. Not just any alpha. King Theron, the Shadow Wolf King of the United Territories. He was a legend, a nightmare whispered to frighten unruly pups. He had taken the throne at a shockingly young age after his father, the previous king, had been torn apart in a brutal wilderness conflict. Theron was said to be more wolf than man, a primal force of nature who ruled with an iron will and a shadow's subtlety. And tonight, under the light of the full moon, he would preside over the choosing, the mandatory ceremony where all unclaimed females of age were presented. It wasn't a choice for us. It was a claiming. A meat market where rank and power took what they wanted. I pressed my forehead against the grimy glass of the single window, peering out into the twilight. The trees stood like silent skeletal sentinels. I was an omega. Scentless, yes, but still bound by the old laws. To be unclaimed at my age was a disgrace. To hide from the choosing was treason. But the thought of standing on that stone platform, a scentless blank in a sea of fragrant, trembling females, while powerful alphas passed me over with sneers of disgust, I couldn't bear it. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sickness in my stomach that was worse than any punishment they could devise. My mother had made me promise. On her deathbed, her hand frail in mine, her voice a thread of sound. "Stay silent, stay hidden. Your time is not theirs to command. Wait for the moon to speak to you." It had sounded like the fevered ramblings of a dying woman, but the desperation in her eyes had been lucid. I had promised. Hiding was not just cowardice, it was an act of love, the last thing I could do for her. I clutched the silver moon around my neck. It felt colder than usual. A shiver traced its way down my spine, unrelated to the evening chill seeping through the cracks in the log walls. The woods, usually a cacophony of nocturnal life, had fallen silent, not a quiet hush, a dead silence. An unnatural void where the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures should have been. It was the kind of silence that precedes a predator. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden stillness. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the one-room shack. It offered no real defense. A rotting door, a flimsy latch, a rickety table, and the cold hearth where I stoling. Hadn't dared light a fire for fear the smoke would give me away. My gaze fell on the small skinning knife I used to gut the rabbits I managed to snare. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was something. My hand closed around the worn wooden handle. the cold steel a useless comfort. Then I heard it, a single heavy footstep, a twig snapping with deliberate, unhurried pressure. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a bear. This was the tread of something that knew it was the apex of this forest, something that had no need for stealth. Another step, closer this time, and with it, a scent. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave that crashed through the shack's meager defenses and filled my lungs. It wasn't just one note, but a symphony of power. It was the sharp, clean bite of winter frost, the deep, ancient smell of pine forests, and the rich, dark scent of freshly turned earth. Underneath it all was something else, something primal and wild that spoke of dominance and raw, untamed power. It was the most potent alpha scent I had ever encountered, and it made the air in my little hideout crackle with energy. My wolf, a tiny, shivering thing I rarely ever felt, whimpered and tried to flatten itself into non-existence within me. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the rough-hewn logs of the far wall. The knife felt slick in my sweaty palm. I was trapped. Whoever this was, they knew I was here. The silence, the scent, the deliberate approach, it was a hunt, and it was over. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. The scent was so thick I could taste it, metallic and electric on my tongue. I held my breath, my knuckles white on the handle of the knife. I expected the door to be torn from its hinges, for the wood to splinter inward. Instead, there was a long, drawn-out moment of silence. I could feel him out there, a vast and terrible presence, considering. Then, a voice. It was not a shout. It was a low, resonant baritone, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the shack and into my bones. It was a voice accustomed to absolute command, a voice that had never known defiance. And it spoke my name, Calaran. The sound of it, spoken by him, shattered the last of my composure. No one had used my name in years. I was the scentless one, the Omega girl, her. To hear it spoken with such quiet certainty by the terrifying presence outside my door was so profoundly shocking that the knife nearly slipped from my fingers. He knew who I was. He had been looking for me. The latch on the door, old and rusted, didn't stand a chance. It didn't splinter. It simply disintegrated with a soft metallic pop as the door swung inward. The figure that filled the doorway blotted out the last of the twilight. A silhouette of impossible size and breadth. He had to duck his head to clear the frame, and even then, his shoulders seemed to brush both sides. The scent of pine and frost and raw power flooded the tiny space, suffocating me. He stepped inside, and the shack, my only sanctuary, shrank to the size of a cage. He was massive, even more so up close. Clad in dark, practical leathers, he was a mountain of muscle and controlled force. His hair was the color of dark ash, pulled back from a face that was all hard lines and sharp angles, a face carved from granite and shadow. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were the color of storm clouds, a swirling, intelligent silver that seemed to see right through my skin, past my fear, and into the broken, hollow space where my secret was kept. They held no malice, no overt aggression, just an unnerving, absolute focus. He was the Shadow Wolf King, King Theron, and he was here, in my pathetic little refuge. My throat was dry, my tongue a useless lump of flesh in my mouth. The knife in my hand felt childish, absurd. His silver eyes flickered down to it, then back to my face. A corner of his mouth tilted, not quite a smirk, more like a flicker of grim acknowledgement. "You will not need that," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. He took another slow step into the room, and I flinched, pressing myself harder against the wall. The movement was so slight it was barely perceptible, but he saw it. He stopped instantly. "I am not here to harm you," he stated, the words simple, declarative. A king's decree. He radiated an aura of such profound authority that it was difficult to breathe, let alone disbelieve him. But I was a cornered animal, and all I knew was fear. "Why are you here?" The words came out as a ragged whisper, scraping my throat raw. It was the most I had spoken to anyone in weeks. His silver gaze was intense, unwavering. "Because you were not where you were supposed to be. At the presentation stone." He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, the king would notice one missing omega from a territory of thousands. The thought was ludicrous. I am no one," I stammered, my voice trembling, scentless, broken. "I am of no value to the choosing." I was reciting the litany of my own failure, the words that had been carved into my soul by years of scorn. For the first time, an emotion other than calm authority flickered in his eyes. It looked like impatience, not with me, but with my words. "You have been told lies, Calaran," he said, his voice dropping even lower, softer. "You are not broken." He took another step, closing the distance between us until only a few feet remained. I could feel the heat radiating from him, see the faint, almost imperceptible shift of silver in his irises, like moonlight on water. His scent wrapped around me, no longer just threatening but inquisitive. It probed and tested the air around me, searching for the thing I knew it would never find. "Look at me." The command was soft, but it held the weight of mountains. My gaze, which had been fixed on the rough floorboards, lifted against my will. I met his eyes, and the sheer force of his presence stole the air from my lungs. "You are hiding," he murmured, his eyes searching my face. "But not from the choosing, not really. Who taught you to hide yourself so completely?" My mother's face flashed in my mind, her desperate, pleading eyes. "Stay silent. Stay hidden." My hand instinctively went to the pendant at my throat, my fingers closing around the cool, familiar shape of the crescent moon. Theron's eyes followed the movement, his gaze fixed on the pendant, and a stillness came over him, so absolute it was terrifying. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He stared at the silver moon nestled in the hollow of my throat as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where?" he said, his voice now a strained, dangerous whisper. "Did you get that?" The question was a blade, sharp and pointed. It cut through the fog of my terror and hit something deep and protective inside me. This was my mother's, the last piece of her I had left. "It was my mother's," I answered, my own voice gaining a sliver of strength from the memory of her. King Theron closed his eyes for a brief second, his jaw tightening. When he opened them again, the silver had deepened to the color of molten steel. "Her name was Alindra," he stated. It wasn't a question. A gasp escaped my lips. How could he know her name? She was a nobody, an Omega who had died in obscurity years ago. No one remembered Alindra. "You are not broken," he repeated, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It sounded like a revelation, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "You are veiled." He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate, giving me every chance to pull away. I was frozen, mesmerized by the certainty in his eyes. His large, calloused fingers didn't touch my skin. They hovered just over the pendant, his fingertips tracing its shape in the air. A strange warmth bloomed on my chest, directly beneath his hand, as if the silver itself were waking up. "This is the mark of a moon speaker," he breathed, his gaze locked with mine. "An anchor, a lineage thought to have been wiped out centuries ago." The words meant nothing to me. Moon speaker, anchor. They were just sounds, foreign and strange. All I understood was the impossible gentleness in this terrifying man, and the way the world seemed to tilt on its axis when he spoke. "I don't understand," I whispered, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his revelation. "I know," he said, and for the first time, a hint of something that sounded like sorrow entered his voice. You were hidden to be protected, but your protectors are gone, and your silence is now a danger, not just to you, but to all of us. He finally let his hand drop. The absence of his proximity left me feeling strangely cold. The shifts, he continued, his tone shifting back to that of a king discussing matters of state. They grow unstable, more violent. Younger wolves are struggling to hold their forms. Older ones are succumbing to rage. My pack, my kingdom, is fraying at the seams. For years, we have been without a stabilizing force, without an anchor. He looked at me, and I felt like the focal point of the entire universe. That is what a moon speaker is, Caloran. A living anchor. Your stillness, the void where your scent should be, is not an absence of power. It is a different kind of power altogether. It is a calm that can soothe the raging beast, a silence that can command the chaos of the shift. My head was spinning. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and fear. I was Caloran, the broken Omega, the scentless dud. I was not some mythical creature from a forgotten legend. Why me? I asked, the question fragile. It is your bloodline, he answered, simply. The magic is in you, dormant and untrained. Alindra must have known. She veiled you, taught you to suppress it so completely that you became invisible. It was the only way to keep you safe from those who would have sought to use you, or destroy you. His gaze swept around my pathetic shack, a silent indictment of my life. Your hiding is over. I cannot force you. The old magic does not respond to coercion, but I am offering you a choice, a real one, not the illusion of the choosing stone. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Come with me to the Citadel, not as a prize, not as a claimed mate, but as what you are. Stand by my side. Learn to wield the power that is your birthright. Help me hold my kingdom together. In return, you will have my protection. You will have a place. You will never be called broken again. He extended his hand to me. It was a king's hand, large and scarred, a hand that had known battle and borne the weight of a crown. But it was offered palm up, a gesture of invitation, not command. A choice. He was offering me a choice. Return to my life of hiding, of scavenging and loneliness, waiting for the inevitable discovery and punishment? Or step into this impossible new reality he was describing? A world where my greatest shame was my greatest strength. My mother's words echoed in my mind. Wait for the moon to speak to you. The king wore a silver signet ring, etched with a wolf howling at a full moon. My fingers were still trembling as I lifted my hand. The skinning knife fell from my other hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. I looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his stormy silver eyes. I saw no deception there, only a desperate, burdened hope. He needed me. The thought was so alien, so staggering, that it finally broke through the last of my fear. Slowly, hesitantly, I placed my small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, his grip firm and warm and impossibly solid. It was not a capture. It was an anchor. The contact sent a jolt of energy through me, a spark that traveled up my arm and settled deep in my chest, right where the pendant lay. In that moment, the shack no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage I had just been freed from. Don't hide from me, Caloran, he murmured, his voice a low, possessive rumble. Not anymore. The journey to the Citadel was a blur. King Theron led me from the shack, his hand never leaving mine. A detail of half a dozen royal guards materialized from the shadows of the trees, their scents sharp and alert cedar, granite, cold steel. They moved with a silent, lethal grace, their eyes showing a flicker of surprise at my presence, but no disrespect. The king's word was law, and he had chosen me. He led me to a massive, pure black horse that stood placidly, its breath misting in the cool night air. With an ease that belied his size, he swung himself into the saddle and then reached down for me. His grip on my waist was firm as he lifted me, seating me in front of him. My back was pressed against the solid wall of his chest, and I was immediately enveloped in his scent, his warmth. It was overwhelming, dizzying. I felt small and fragile tucked against him, but for the first time in my life, I also felt utterly safe. The horse moved, and the forest that had been my prison for weeks receded into the darkness behind us. We arrived at the citadel as the first hints of dawn were streaking the sky. It was less a castle and more a mountain that had been carved into a fortress, its black stone towers piercing the clouds. It was intimidating, a monument to raw, unyielding power. As we rode through the massive gates, the sense of the court washed over me, a complex tapestry of hundreds of powerful shifters. Their individual aromas of pine, riverstone, moss, and rich earth, mingling with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and beeswax. It was an assault on my senses, which had grown accustomed to the simple palate of damp earth and decay. It made my head swim. Theron must have felt my tension, the slight tremor that ran through my body. His arm, which had been resting loosely around my waist, tightened. "You are under my protection here," he rumbled, his voice low and for my ears only. "No one will harm you." His protection was immediately put to the test. I was whisked away by a stern-faced beta female who introduced herself as Lysandra. She had been assigned as my handmaiden. Her scent was practical and clean, like fresh linen and chamomile, and though her expression was severe, her eyes held a flicker of curiosity rather than contempt. She led me to a suite of rooms that was larger than my entire shack, furnished with rich tapestries, a soft feather bed, and a steaming bath already waiting for me. "The king has commanded that you be prepared for the evening feast," she said, her tone neutral. "He will be formally presenting you to the court." Panic, a cold and familiar friend, fluttered in my chest. A feast? The court? I was used to shadows and solitude, not the scrutiny of hundreds of high-ranking wolves. I owned nothing but the tattered tunic and leggings I stood in. Lysandra seemed to read my thoughts. "Gowns have been provided." The king was thorough in his preparations. She gestured to a large wardrobe, and my apprehension warred with a dawning sense of wonder. Theron hadn't just found me. He had been planning for me. Hours later, I stood before a tall, silver-backed mirror, a stranger staring back at me. Lysandra had been ruthlessly efficient. My tangled hair was washed and brushed until it fell in soft, dark waves down my back. The gown she had chosen was a deep forest green, the color of moss after a rain. It was simple, elegant, and miraculously, it fit perfectly. But it couldn't hide the fear in my eyes or the way I still instinctively hunched my shoulders, trying to make myself smaller. The only familiar thing about my reflection was the silver crescent moon at my throat. "You look presentable," Lysandra stated, her version of a high compliment. "Keep your head up. Show no fear. They will smell it on you." "They can't," I whispered, the old shame rising. "There's nothing to smell." Lysandra looked at me, a strange expression on her face. "That is not entirely true, my lady. Around you, there is quiet. It is most peculiar." She didn't seem to know what to make of it, but she didn't say it with disgust. She said it with a clinical curiosity that was almost refreshing. When Theron came to escort me, the breath caught in my throat. He had shed his rugged travel leathers for formal court attire, a tunic of the deepest black, embroidered with silver thread that traced the shape of a howling wolf on his chest. The color made his silver eyes seem even more luminous, more intense. His presence filled the room, his powerful scent of winter, and pine a stark, living contrast to the quiet that surrounded me. He stopped in front of me, his gaze sweeping over me from head to toe. A low sound, a soft growl of approval, rumbled in his chest. "Green suits you," he said, his voice husky. He offered me his arm, and I placed my hand on the hard muscle of his forearm, my fingers trembling slightly. The contact was electric, a current of warmth that steadied me. The great hall was a cavern of noise, light, and overwhelming scents. 100 long tables were filled with the highest-ranking alphas and betas of the United Packs. Their combined aromas were a thick, heady perfume of power and pride. All conversation ceased the moment we entered. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, gold, brown, amber, fixed on us, on me. I could feel their scrutiny like a physical touch, their senses probing, searching for my scent, for my status, and finding only that strange, unnerving quiet that Lysandra had mentioned. Whispers erupted like wildfire, a low hiss that spread through the hall. A scentless Omega? What is the king thinking? She looks like a stray. I flinched, my steps faltering. Theron's hand covered mine on his arm, his grip tightening reassuringly. "Ignore them," he murmured, his voice a low command that cut through the noise. "They are hounds, barking at what they do not understand. Look only at me." I forced myself to obey, lifting my chin and focusing on the solid, unshakable presence beside me. He led me not to a seat among the masses, but to the high table, on a raised dais overlooking the entire hall. He seated me in the chair to his right, a place of honor usually reserved for a guest of the highest status or a chosen mate. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. It was then that they arrived. The doors to the great hall swung open again, and a man strode in, flanked by his entourage. He was older, with a handsome but severe face, and a scent of cold stone and ambition. I recognized him from the hushed conversations I'd overheard in my old pack. Lord Valerius, a high counselor, and the alpha of a powerful neighboring clan. He was known for his rigid adherence to the old ways, to the brutal traditions of strength above all. But it was the woman at his side who drew every eye. She was tall, statuesque, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes, as blue as a summer sky. Her scent was powerful for a beta female, a heady mix of night-blooming jasmine and spice. She moved with a liquid grace and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. This was his daughter, Cyrilda. It was common knowledge that Valerius intended for her to be Theron's queen, to unite their powerful lines. Cyrilda's gaze swept the high table and landed on me. Her perfectly shaped lips curled into a sneer of pure, undiluted contempt. She saw a nobody, an obstacle, sitting in her rightful place. Lord Valerius approached the dais, his expression a mask of polite inquiry that didn't quite hide the fury in his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "you honor us with your return, and with a guest." His eyes flicked to me, dismissing me in an instant. "Calerin is more than a guest, Valerius," Theron replied, his tone deceptively mild. "She is under my personal protection." Valerius's eyebrows raised. "An Omega? A scentless one, if the whispers are to be believed? An interesting choice for your protection, my king. In these unstable times, one would think strength would beget strength." The challenge was clear, a public questioning of Theron's judgment. The entire hall held its breath. Cyrilda stepped forward, a dazzling, predatory smile on her face. "Perhaps the king has a taste for charity," she said, her voice musical but laced with venom. "It is noble to care for the pack's weakest members." The insult was a physical blow. Weakest member. It was everything I had ever been called. I shrank in my chair, the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck. I wanted the stone floor to swallow me whole. But then, I felt Theron's gaze on me. "Look at me," the command echoed in my mind. I forced my head up, my eyes meeting his. I saw no pity in them, only a silent, steady encouragement. And something else, a challenge. My mother's voice whispered in my memory, "There is a different kind of power in listening." I took a slow breath, the cacophony of scents and sounds in the hall seeming to recede. I wasn't a warrior. I wasn't a politician, but I had spent a lifetime observing from the shadows, listening to the undercurrents of conversations, feeling the subtle shifts in mood that no one else noticed. I looked at Lord Valerius, at the tight set of his jaw, at Cyrilda, at the possessive gleam in her eyes as she looked at Theron. They didn't see a king. They saw a prize to be won, a throne to be acquired. Their ambition was a stench far fouler than any lack of scent on my part. Strength is not always a shout, Lord Valerius, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the sudden hush. It carried farther than I expected. Sometimes, the greatest strength is the quiet that holds the storm at bay. The words were my mother's, but they were my own now. A stunned silence fell over the hall. No one had expected the scentless Omega to speak. Lord Valerius looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, a flicker of surprised anger in his eyes. Cyrilda's smile faltered, her blue eyes narrowing into slits. A low, deep rumble came from beside me. It was Theron. He was laughing. A quiet, appreciative sound that sent a shiver of warmth through me. He pushed back his chair and stood, his towering form commanding every ounce of attention in the room. He held his hand out to me. "The musicians are playing," he said, his silver eyes glittering with approval. "Dance with me, Caloran." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. In front of his entire court, his most powerful rivals, the Shadow Wolf King was choosing the scentless Omega. As my fingers slipped into his, I felt the balance of power in the great hall shift, tilting precariously toward the quiet girl from the woods. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that Cyrilda and her father would never forgive me for it. Being in Theron's arms was like standing in the eye of a hurricane. The chaos of the court, the whispers, the speculative stares, the suffocating miasma of ambition and jealousy all faded into a distant roar. There was only the solid feel of his hand on my back, the firm grip of his other hand holding mine, and the overwhelming, hypnotic scent of him. Pine, winter frost, and that untamable wildness that was uniquely his. He moved with a predator's grace, leading me through the steps of a slow, formal court dance I barely knew. I stumbled once, my feet clumsy, but he held me steady, his strength a silent promise. "You surprised them?" he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at my temple. His voice was a low vibration against my ear, meant only for me. "You surprised me?" "I only spoke the truth," I whispered, my gaze fixed on the silver wolf embroidered on his tunic. I couldn't bring myself to meet the eyes of the watching court. "Truth is a rare and dangerous weapon in a place like this," he replied, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Use it wisely." The dance felt both fleeting and eternal. When the music finally ended, the return to the high table was like surfacing from a deep dive. The air felt thin, the sounds too loud. Cyrilda's gaze was glacial. She had recovered her composure, but the hatred in her eyes was a palpable force. Lord Valerius was engaged in a low, intense conversation with a scarred, hulking alpha at his table, his eyes flicking toward me periodically with cold calculation. The battle lines had been drawn. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Theron kept me close, either by his side in the throne room as he dispensed judgments, a silent observer in his war council, or walking the high battlements of the citadel. He was teaching me, showing me the intricate workings of his kingdom, the pressures he faced. He explained the growing plague of shift fever, a madness that caused wolves to lose control during the change. Sometimes permanently, it was what had killed his father. His pack alpha had lost control, and in the ensuing chaos, the king had fallen. Theron, then only a young alpha himself, had been forced to put down his own father's most loyal friend and assume the throne. The burden of that day was a shadow I could now see in his silver eyes. "The anchors of old," he explained one evening as we stood looking out over the moonlit valley, "could soothe the fever with their presence alone. They were the heart of the pack, the calm center that allowed the wolf and man to exist in balance. Without that, we are becoming more beast than man." He was giving me context, Purpose. The fear that had been my constant companion for years began to slowly recede, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning sense of duty. He believed I could be this anchor. He was betting his kingdom on it. The test of that belief came sooner than I expected. Lysandra, my ever-practical attendant, had suggested I get some fresh air, away from the stuffy confines of the castle. "The training grounds are quiet this time of day," she'd said. "The trainees won't be there for another hour." It was a lie, a calculated, venomous lie. The moment I stepped onto the packed earth of the training grounds, a large open space bordered by the forest, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with the scent of adolescent fear and aggression, a sour, unstable smell. A group of about a dozen young shifters, barely more than pups, were gathered in the center of the field. They were in the midst of their first forced shift, a brutal rite of passage I'd only heard about in fearful whispers. An older, scarred alpha I recognized from Valerius's table. A brute named Crathor was barking orders at them, his voice raw and cruel. And watching from the edge of the grounds, half hidden by a stone archway, was Cyrilda. A triumphant, vicious smile played on her lips. It was a trap. "Embrace the pain. The wolf is rage. Let it consume you," Crathor roared. This was the old way, the brutal method Valerius championed, forcing the change through pain and fury. It was the opposite of the balance Theron sought. One of the boys, no older than 15, was screaming. His body was contorting, bones snapping and reforming. His form flickered violently between boy and wolf, a horrifying, unstable hybrid of stretched skin and sprouting fur. The scent of his terror and agony was a physical spike in the air. The other trainees backed away, their own shifts faltering in the face of his uncontrolled transformation. The situation was spiraling into chaos. Crathor just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Let the weak be broken. It is the way." Cyrilda's eyes found mine across the field. Her smile widened. This was my test. She wanted to see the king's charity case fail, to see me run screaming. She wanted to prove to everyone that I was useless. Rage, cold and pure, surged through me. It wasn't the hot rage of a wolf, but the icy fury of a protector. This wasn't a political game. This was a child being tortured. My mother's words echoed, not as a memory, but as a command. "You were born to listen." I listened. Beneath the boy's screams of pain, I could feel the frantic, terrified heartbeat of his wolf, thrashing like a drowning animal. It wasn't malicious, it was lost. I didn't think. I acted. I walked forward, onto the training ground, my simple green dress a stark contrast to the dirt and blood. Crathor turned on me, his face contorted in a snarl. "Get back, scentless bitch. This is no place for you." I ignored him. My focus was entirely on the screaming boy. His eyes, flickering between human brown and lupine gold, were wide with mindless panic. The other trainees were frozen, their own bodies trembling on the verge of losing control. I didn't know what to do, what magic I supposedly possessed, so I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for the stillness inside me, the quiet void that I had always considered a curse. Instead of shrinking from it, I embraced it. I let it fill me, a deep, silent pool of calm, and then I let it out. I didn't push it. I simply released it, like opening a floodgate. A wave of profound silence emanated from me, not an absence of sound, but an absence of chaos. It rolled across the training field, washing over the panicked trainees. The sour scent of fear didn't vanish, but it thinned, diluted by a sudden, inexplicable peace. The boy's screams subsided into ragged gasps. His violently flickering form began to slow, the transitions becoming less jarring. His panicked golden eyes found mine. He was still in agony, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of awareness, of self, within the storm. "Breathe," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the uncanny quiet I had created, it carried with the weight of a bell. Find your center. The wolf is not your enemy. It is you. I took a step closer, my hand outstretched. The boy, caught halfway between forms, whimpered. Krathor started to move toward me, his face black with fury at my interference, but a shadow fell over the field. Theron was there. He hadn't run. He had simply appeared, a force of nature materializing from the edge of the forest. He wasn't alone. Half the royal guard was with him, their sense a bristling wall of protective fury. But the king only had eyes for me and the scene unfolding. His face was unreadable, his silver eyes blazing. I ignored them all. My focus was on the boy. I remembered Theron's hand on mine, the feeling of being anchored. I projected that feeling, that sense of solid, unshakable calm toward the boy. You are not alone, I whispered. You are not lost. Let go of the rage. Just be. And then, the most miraculous thing happened. The boy's body gave one last, violent shudder, and then settled. With a soft sigh, the transformation completed, not into a snarling monster, but into a sleek, brown-furred wolf pup. He was trembling, exhausted, but he was whole. He was stable. He blinked his intelligent wolf eyes at me, then took a stumbling step forward and nudged his wet nose against my outstretched hand before collapsing to the ground in a heap of exhausted sleep. A collective sigh of relief went through the other trainees. One by one, their own struggling forms stabilized, their shifts completing into tired but controlled wolf forms. The wave of calm had anchored them all. The silence that followed was broken by a furious snarl. "What trickery is this?" Krathor bellowed, turning on me. "You have interfered. You have made them weak." He never finished his sentence. In a blur of motion too fast to follow, Theron crossed the field. He didn't shift. He didn't have to. He grabbed the front of Krathor's tunic, lifting the hulking alpha clear off his feet with one hand. Krathor, who outweighed Theron in sheer bulk, dangled like a child's doll. "You!" Theron growled, his voice a low, lethal promise of violence. "Will never touch a trainee of this pack again. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. Your brutal methods are finished." He threw Krathor to the ground, and the scarred alpha scrambled away like a beaten dog, his arrogance shattered. Theron then turned, his gaze sweeping the edge of the field. I saw his eyes lock on the stone archway. Serilda was gone. She had vanished the moment the king had appeared. Finally, his molten silver gaze came to rest on me. I was trembling, the adrenaline and the effort of whatever I had just done, leaving me dizzy and drained. I felt like I might collapse. He crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, cupped my face in his large, warm hands, and tilted my head up. His eyes searched mine, and in their depths, I saw awe, relief, and a burning, possessive fury on my behalf. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "You were magnificent," he breathed. He leaned down, and in front of his guards, the newly shifted pups, and the whole world, he pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to my forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound respect. A king honoring his equal. The moment his lips touched my skin, the world righted itself. I wasn't the broken Omega. I wasn't the scentless stray. I was a moon speaker. I was an anchor, and I had just saved them. A dizzying, unfamiliar sense of self-worth bloomed in my chest, fragile but real. I had found my voice, not in a shout, but in the quiet. My mother had been right. Theron didn't release me. He gathered me into his arms, lifting me as if I weighed nothing, and began to carry me back toward the citadel. My head rested against his shoulder, his steady heartbeat, a calming rhythm beneath my ear. "You are drained," he murmured, his voice a protective rumble. You gave too much of yourself. I was too exhausted to protest. Being held by him felt right, like a missing piece of my soul slotting into place. As he carried me through the castle corridors, guards and servants alike averted their eyes, their sense a mixture of awe and fear. The whispers that followed us now were not of contempt, but of wonder. The scentless Omega had calmed the shift fever. The legend of the Moon Speaker, once a forgotten myth, was being reborn in the halls of the Citadel. He didn't take me back to my assigned rooms. He carried me past them, up a winding stone staircase, and through a heavy oak door into his own private study. The room was the heart of his power, filled with maps, ancient texts, and the potent, comforting scent of him. A large fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He gently set me down in a large, worn leather armchair near the flames, then knelt before me. "I am sorry, Calaran," he said, his voice raw. "I brought you into this nest of vipers without preparing you. I put you in danger." "It wasn't your fault," I whispered, finding my voice at last. "It was Cyrilda. She led me there." A low, vicious growl escaped his throat, the sound of a predator promising retribution. "She and her father will answer for this. Lord Valerius has been testing the limits of my patience for years, pushing his archaic and brutal traditions, undermining my authority. Using you to do it is his final mistake." He took my hands in his. They were cold, and his were so warm. "What you did? Back there. I have only ever read about it in the oldest scrolls. You didn't just calm them. You connected with them. You anchored their spirits to their bodies. I felt it, even from the edge of the forest. A wave of absolute peace. I just listened," I said, trying to explain the inexplicable. I felt how scared the boy's wolf was. I tried to show it that it wasn't alone. Theron's gaze was full of a wondering reverence that made me feel more powerful than any alpha's roar. That is the gift, Calaran. Empathy made manifest. The ability to feel the fractured spirit and make it whole. He squeezed my hands. "My father, he died in a shift. Fever. His oldest friend, his beta, lost control. It wasn't his fault. The instability had been growing for a generation. But no one understood it. They called it madness, a blood curse. My father died trying to reach his friend, to bring him back. He failed. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and painful. I could see the confession hung in the air between us. Memory in his eyes, the grief and the crushing weight of responsibility he'd carried ever since. He had been so young, forced to kill a man he loved and take a throne he wasn't ready for, all while his kingdom was slowly succumbing to a disease no one understood. His loneliness was a vast, empty space around him, a chasm I suddenly felt a desperate need to fill. "You have been carrying this all by yourself," I whispered, my heart aching for him. "A king cannot show weakness," he said, the words rote, drilled into him by years of solitary rule. "But with you," he hesitated, his silver eyes searching mine. "With you, the silence is not empty. It's peaceful." He lifted one of my hands and pressed a kiss to the palm, his lips soft against my skin. "The scrolls say the Moon Speaker and the Alpha King are two halves of a whole, the fury and the calm, the storm and the anchor. I never believed it. I thought it was just a myth." "And now?" I asked, my breath catching. "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur, "I believe I have been living only half a life." He moved me into the suite of rooms adjoining his own that night. They were even more opulent than the last, with a balcony that overlooked the entire kingdom. The move was a statement, a clear and undeniable signal to the entire court. I was no longer just a guest under his protection. I was his. The intimacy between us deepened in the days that followed. It wasn't just physical proximity. It was in the way he would seek me out at the end of a long day, sinking into a chair beside me in front of the fire, his silence companionable, not strained. It was in the small gestures, his hand finding mine as we walked the battlements, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. He spoke to me of his fears for his people, of the political machinations of lords like Valerius. I, in turn, told him of my lonely childhood, of my mother's quiet strength and her cryptic final words. We were building a bridge between two very different solitudes. One evening, he found me on my balcony, staring up at the waxing moon. I was clutching my pendant, the memory of my mother strong that night. He came to stand behind me, his presence a familiar comfort. He didn't speak for a long time, simply resting his hands on the stone balustrade on either side of me, creating a protective circle with his body. "She would be proud of you," he said softly. Tears pricked my eyes. "She would be terrified. She only ever wanted me to be safe. You are safe with me," he vowed, his voice a low rumble against my back. "I will let no one harm you." He turned me then, his hands gentle on my shoulders. The moonlight bathed his face in silver, making his eyes glow. "But your mother was wrong about one thing. You were not meant to stay hidden. You were meant to shine." His gaze dropped to my lips. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that had been building between us for days. The scents of pine and winter frost were intoxicating, pulling me closer. This was not the intimidating Alpha King, but Theron, the lonely man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. "Kelleran," he whispered, his voice thick with need. He lowered his head, his face drawing nearer to mine. My heart hammered in my chest, a wild, frantic rhythm. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. I lifted my chin, meeting him halfway. His lips were firm and warm, a stark contrast to the cool night air. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as I leaned into him, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, it deepened. It was a kiss of searing possession and profound relief, of a lonely king finally finding his anchor, and a hidden girl finally finding her home. It was the storm meeting the calm, and in that collision, something new and powerful was forged. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath mingling with mine. His silver eyes were dark with emotion. "Don't hide from me," he whispered, the words no longer a command, but a desperate plea. Never again. In the week leading up to the full moon, the citadel was a hotbed of tension. Lord Valerius and his allies were openly hostile, their scents thick with aggression whenever I was near. Cyrilda watched me with the cold patience of a spider waiting in its web, but the fear they once inspired in me had been replaced by a quiet resolve. I was no longer the girl from the shack. I stood by Theron's side, a silent but undeniable presence. My calm soothed the frayed nerves of the court, and more than one older beta had approached me quietly, thanking me for the peace I seemed to carry. The story of the training grounds had spread, and I was now regarded with a mixture of fear, respect, and hope. The night of the choosing ceremony arrived, clear and cold. The full moon hung in the sky like a silver coin, bathing the ancient ceremonial grounds in its ethereal light. It was a wide circular clearing outside the citadel walls, dominated by a flat granite altar known as the Choosing Stone. This was the place I had fled from, the source of my deepest dread. Tonight, I walked toward it willingly, my hand resting securely in Theron's. I wore a gown of pure white, embroidered with silver thread that mirrored the carving on my pendant. It had been Lysandra's choice. "White is the color of the moon," she'd said, a rare, small smile touching her lips. "It is the color of new beginnings." The entire kingdom, it seemed, was gathered. The air was electric, thick with anticipation and the potent sense of thousands of shifters. Theron led me not to the sidelines, but directly to the foot of the dais where the choosing stone stood. He turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding absolute silence. "Tonight," he began, his voice resonating through the clearing, "we honor the old traditions. We strengthen our pacts. We secure our future. Before he could continue, Lord Valerius stepped forward, positioning himself directly in Theron's path. Cyrilda was at his side, looking radiant and triumphant in a blood-red gown. "Your Majesty," Valerius declared, his voice ringing with false deference. "The tradition is for the Alpha King to choose a mate who will bring strength to the kingdom, a queen who can stand against our enemies, who carries a powerful bloodline." His gaze swept over the crowd. "In these times of instability, we need a queen of substance, of power, not a charity case." He gestured dismissively in my direction, though he didn't look at me. "I propose a true union of strength," he boomed. "My daughter Cyrilda, of the ancient and powerful line of the Stone Wolves. Let her be your queen. Let us unite our clans and forge a kingdom of unbreakable might." A roar of approval went up from Valerius's supporters, a vocal minority, but a powerful one. Cyrilda stepped forward, lifting her chin and offering Theron a dazzling smile. She was the perfect picture of a desirable alpha mate, beautiful, confident, and from a strong bloodline. She was everything I was not. The choice, framed this way, seemed obvious. For a heart-stopping moment, the old fear returned, a cold serpent coiling in my stomach. Theron looked from Valerius to Cyrilda, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He was silent for a long moment, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. Cyrilda's smile began to look strained. Then Theron turned his head and looked directly at me. His silver eyes were blazing with a fire that was all for me. He held out his hand. "Caloran." My name, spoken with such possessive certainty, was his answer. I placed my hand in his, and he drew me forward, to stand beside him, facing the stunned councilman and his daughter. "You speak of strength, Valerius," Theron said, his voice dangerously soft. "You speak of powerful bloodlines, but your understanding of both is pathetic and shallow." He turned his gaze back to the crowd. "You see this woman," he said, his voice rising, ringing with power. "And you see an Omega. You sense a void. You call her weak. You are fools." He lifted our joined hands. "You stand in the presence of a power you thought lost to myth, a bloodline older and more vital than any of yours. This is Caliran of the line of Alindra, a true daughter of the moon. She is not a scentless Omega. She is a moon speaker. She is our anchor." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. Moonspeaker. The name was whispered from wolf to wolf, a forgotten legend brought to life. "Strength is not the rage of the beast," Theron declared, his voice thundering with conviction. "It is the calm that masters it. For generations our people have been afflicted by the shift, fever because we have been adrift, unanchored. Caliran is our salvation. She is the quiet that holds the storm at bay. That is strength, Valerius. A strength your bloodline of rock and rage could never comprehend." He dismissed the councilman with a final, contemptuous look and turned fully to me. Cyrilda's face was a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. Her perfect future had just crumbled into dust. Theron took my other hand, holding both of them in his. He looked into my eyes, and the entire world, the thousands of watching wolves, melted away. There was only him. "I do not choose you as a mate to be claimed," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate despite the audience. "I do not choose you as a tool to fix my kingdom. I choose you as my partner, my equal, my queen." He brought my hands to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "Will you stand with me, Caliran? Will you be the anchor to my storm, the moon to my night?" The tears that had been threatening finally fell, tracing paths of warmth down my cheeks. This was not the fate I had hidden from. This was the destiny my mother had promised. This was the moon speaking to me through the voice of its chosen wolf. "Yes," I whispered, the word full of all the hope and love and sense of belonging I had never known. "Yes, Theron." A true, brilliant smile broke across his face, transforming his harsh features into something breathtakingly handsome. He reached up and gently unclasped the silver crescent moon from my neck. Then, he unclasped a chain from his own, from which hung his signet ring, the silver wolf howling at the moon. In a gesture of ancient binding ritual, he fastened my pendant around his neck and his ring around mine. The heavy silver wolf settled against my sternum, warm from his skin. It was a perfect fit. He sealed the vow with a kiss. In front of the entire kingdom, the Alpha King kissed his moonspeaker, not with the fire of possession, but with the deep, abiding promise of a shared future. A roar went up from the crowd, not of factional support, but of pure, unadulterated joy. Their king had not just found a mate. He had found hope. Later that night, we stood on the balcony of our shared chambers, the sounds of celebration still echoing from the halls below. The moon was high and full, bathing the world in its gentle, silvery light. Theron's arms were wrapped around me from behind, his chin resting on the top of my head. My fingers traced the shape of the howling wolf on the ring that now hung around my neck. Lord Valerius and Cyrilda have been confined to their quarters. He murmured into my hair. They will be exiled at sunrise. Their brand of poison has no place here anymore. I leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my spine. I was no longer the girl hiding in the forest. I was no longer broken, or defective, or a dud. I was Caloran, the Moonspeaker, queen of the United Pax. I was the calm center of the storm. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. I considered the question. The path ahead would not be easy. There were still lords who would resist this change, still ancient prejudices to overcome. The shift fever would not be cured in a day. But for the first time in my life, I was not facing the future alone. "No," I answered, my voice clear and firm. I turned in his arms to face him, my hands coming to rest on his chest. I looked up into his beautiful, stormy silver eyes. "With you, I'm not afraid of anything." He smiled, that rare, brilliant smile that was only for me. He lowered his head and captured my lips in a kiss that was both a promise and a beginning. As the moonlight washed over us, I knew my hiding was truly over. I had found my place, not in the shadows, but in the heart of the wolf, under the light of the moon. And it was exactly where I belonged.